Hello, and thank you for joining us at NFCP, this latest recording, where we are joined by David Tannenbaum from Blackstone Compliance Services. He is quite popular around the compliance industry, especially when it comes to sanctions and the maritime risk. So if you haven't heard of him, I'm sure you will hear a lot more of him going forward. So I'm very happy you could join us. But before we kick off, I just want to do a bit of housekeeping. So if you don't know, we're NFCP, the Network for Financial Crime Prevention. We're a community-based nonprofit that's here for you. It's here for the community. So whatever you need, we'll try to our best to address those concerns and try to provide valuable thought leadership and education as much as possible. And if you don't follow us already, please follow us on LinkedIn. We also have a website, which is nfcp.info. So you can reach out to us, become a member, see what we've been up to, all that good stuff. And yeah, so also really quickly, whatever we discuss today is for informational purposes only. This is not legal advice. So if you have any specific questions or concerns, please escalate that internally within the organization that you work for. All right, so getting that all out of the way. So again, I'm very pleased and appreciative of David for joining us today. He is from the United States, like I am. I'm wearing my New York Mets shirt in honor of that connection. I know you live in the DC area now, so maybe if you are a Oriole or a Nationals fan, I apologize. But yes, I have a fellow American with me today. We're going to talk about some different topics, but focused around the dark fleet and why it's important. And so, yeah, David, if you could just give us an introduction to yourself and Blackstone and all the good stuff you've been up to.
Okay, and thank you so much for having me. This is exciting. So, as you said, my name is David Tannenbaum, and I specialize in sanctions and anti-money laundering. I started out at OFAC around 14 years ago, almost 15 years at this point. Was there long enough to get dangerous, and I've spent most of my time working with financial institutions. I served as the monitor for a bank, and I led the sanctions testing for 3 monitorships. So I'm very well acquainted with what happens, in the ops rooms and the payment rooms. But more importantly, and more relevant to today, I'm also the head of Deep Blue Intelligence, which is a joint project between my firm, Blackstone, and Polestar Global, another maritime intelligence firm. And we're responsible for tracking the dark fleet. We race ahead and identify the vessels that are engaged in sanctions evasion so that we can hopefully keep our clients out of trouble. But really, my favorite part of the job also is we're tasked with figuring out how they're evading sanctions and then developing countermeasures against it. So, every day is that cat and mouse game that we love to play. But once again, thank you so much for having me.
No, it's really great for you to be here, I think, and especially because for me, for me, I've been really passionate about maritime risk for a long time. When I got started out in compliance in 2013, I would say there was very little on maritime at the time. But then the year after, or subsequent years, when vessels started being sanctioned, I was part of that confused group of compliance officers. Like, okay, how are we going to wrap our heads around this? What do we do now? But yeah, since then, I've been quite passionate about how to kind of stay out in front of the risk that's involved there. And now with the, I guess, the exploitation of the dark fleet by Russia, I mean, it's kind of been there for a while in terms of Iran, but now further being expanded with Russia. I just felt like this is a very topical issue, especially for the Nordics, because a lot of these ships are sailing through the waters every day. And I think there's maybe a lack of awareness of the risks that are involved and how to kind of maybe address those risks in certain instances. It depends on your industry. It's not just a shipping issue, right? This is an issue that has a long spectrum going across different issues, especially financial crime. So yeah, that's why I thought it would be really good to have you here so we could start digging in a bit deeper and hopefully getting people a bit more interested in it, trying to put their best foot forward.
Exactly. And I mean, it's interesting because, you're right that starting 2013 with or 2011, I'd say with Sasada kind of heating up and everything like that for Iran, we started using vessel tracking tools that had been used to vet a vessel to see if this is seaworthy. And now we're here today where, I mean, it's a wild world in the maritime industry. I'm not going to lie. Like some of the stories that we have, like on a daily basis, I'd say like nothing phases us anymore. It's so yeah, no, this should be fun.
Cool. Yes, let's jump into it. As we mentioned, you were talking about the dark fleet. That's the main, I guess, one of the main topics of today. And as I mentioned, this is for informational purposes. Let's kind of start from the beginning and provide a foundation for people. So, would you be able to define the dark fleet and how it's evolved over the past few years, especially in the context of the Russian oil trade?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it's the dark fleet is a newer term, as you mentioned and alluded to, just now also that, maritime sanctions, this is not the new thing, right? But Iran used vessels to evade sanctions, but we never kind of had a term for it. But I think the term the dark fleet generally encompasses vessels, tanker vessels that are engaged in evading either the price cap on Russian crude or sanctions against Iran and Venezuela. It's massive. We have 1,300 vessels on our list alone that we consider to be part of the dark fleet that are tankers, engaged in a variety of tasks. Some of them are VLCCs carrying, $80, $100 million of crude at any given time. Some of them are little dinky boats doing bunkering and stuff like that. I'm not going to say the size of our backlog, but I would not be surprised if in the next month we added another 100 to that list, right? And it's become a huge risk. You can't really anymore say that there's a Russian dark fleet and an Iranian dark fleet. That 2 years ago, when this phenomenon started, we had different dark fleets, right? There wasn't a lot of crossover. But now we have vessels that are crossing over across multiple sanctions programs. It also has become very hard that if the U.S. wants to say, we're not going to do Russia sanctions, and Europe says we're going to not do Iran sanctions, which may change on the 28th, by the way. It's very hard to avoid the confluence of those, right? So yeah, I hope that answered it well enough.
Yeah, it did, and I guess it raised a kind of another question because again, we're trying to provide a baseline. You mentioned bunkering, and a lot of people don't know what bunkering actually is. There was actually a high-profile case here in Denmark recently, in the last, I would say, 2 to 3 years, where Dan Bunkering was found guilty of evading sanctions by selling fuel to the Syrian Air Force. So, yeah, if you could just give us a quick definition of bunkering and why that's also an issue.
Yeah, absolutely. So bunkering, I mean, the quick definition, it's the act of refueling another vessel, right? So much like we pull our car up to a gas station and get fuel, that is what a vessel calls bunkers, right? I think the more complex answer is that like bunker, I mean, it's an entire business, obviously. And it's certainly more than the 12 gallons of gas that my CRV holds, right? But the bunkering industry is essentially quasi commodities traders as well, right? That they're buying, marine fuel, it's refined petroleum at this point, and then they're selling it on to another person. So I like to call them pocket commodities traders, but it's a high risk business because dark fleet needs fuel. That fuel can wind up with the distributor aboard vessels that you did not intend to go to. And that's how you would get sort of in trouble in this business.
Yeah, thank you for that. And it's true, it's kind of that quasi middleman that some people don't realize is there, but they could definitely have an impact to this conversation. And now continuing on with the dark fleet, what are the most significant risks that you see posed by the fleet and the global maritime security, and not just maritime security, but also environmental standards?
Exactly. I mean, and I'm glad you touched on that because it's not just sanctions risk. And even in the maritime industry, if you're looking at sort of what's just popping up on OFAC civil penalties or what OFSI's doing, like you're getting a very small slice of the risk that's out there. So, I mean, so first off, right, the dark fleet vessels, some of them are under sanctions now. About a third of my list has now eventually been sanctioned. They weren't when we put the vessel on, obviously, but we don't take them off. And I mean, chances are if you're dealing with a dark fleet vessel, you're dealing with either Iranian crude or Venezuelan crude or outside the price cap, or, the involvement of a sanctioned person directly or indirectly, or where they have a contingent interest in it, right? So there's that risk. But there's all these other risks that actually my team deals with on a daily basis that I think are more significant. if you're a commodities trader or you're a bank that's financing a transaction and it's for, say, $80 million of oil, and halfway through you find out that it's Iranian, well, your best case scenario is OFAC is going to issue you a license to sell the goods and place the proceeds in a blocked account, right? So you're already out the money. That's not fun. We are starting to see civil liability lawsuits crop up. The Anti-Terrorism Act allows victims of terrorism to sue persons who materially support terrorist organizations, right? So this would be FTOs. So we actually see a lot of litigation that comes from lawsuits where someone will accidentally violate sanctions involving Iran and potentially the IRGC. And now not only are they dealing with the subpoena from the FBI and OFAC, they're also dealing with this lawsuit as well. So there's a lot of that going on. Or when someone doesn't actually do their compliance and they kind of screw the person upstream, that person sometimes then uses their sanctions clause, not just to terminate the agreement, but to turn around and sue them. And then finally, there's sort of the environmental risk. And these are going to be massive, right? Because these dark fleet vessels oftentimes don't carry good insurance. We have an entire list of insurers that they only seem to provide coverage to vessels engaged in sanctions evasion. And we don't believe that they're actually providing real insurance or cover, right? The bad guys are just going to them so the vessel can actually enter a port and say that they have like the veneer of legitimacy that they're being insured and stuff like that. So the dark fleet's essentially this environmental ticking time bomb that when one of these vessels is going to go down, it's either going to be insured by a sanctioned person like Ingostrock, or the reinsurer is like the Russian National Reinsurance Corporation, which itself is under sanction. Or it's one of these fly-by-nights and no one's going to be able to clean up the mess. And the affected government that's left with the bill, they're not going to take it lying down, right? They're going to turn around and start suing all the parties involved. And it's much worse. I mean, like dealing with OFAC is a bad day for any institution, but dealing with a $2 billion cleanup could be existential for most institutions, right? So there's just, I guess the message I want to get here is that it's not just, this is a sanctions issue. There are all these other issues that we have to put these fires out for as well. So
exactly. Thank you for mentioning that. And I guess, a nice segue into the next question is, how do you feel the dark fleet, not feet, is specifically impacting or has impacted the Nordics, both maybe in economic terms or maybe in regulatory challenges? Have maybe any insight into that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's two answers to this question. The first one's the easy one, right? Which is that, international financial institutions, wherever you're located, it doesn't matter. You're going to have exposure, right? If you have a shipping company or oil traders as clients, they're going to have compliance issues that you need to monitor, right? That, hey, who are they dealing with? Who are their counterparties? But more specifically to the Nordics, right? Copenhagen, Oslo, those are centers of shipping, right? They are like every year, the big shipping conference of the year is called Nor Shipping, and it occurs in Norway, right? So there's a reason that happens. It's that, you have a lot of the shipping giants in the Nordics. So, banks are going to have them as clients. You're going to have a lot of ship financing. I know Danske Bank and I think Nordea also do a lot of ship financing, so if you're a bank and you're financing a vessel and then you find out halfway down the line, that it's going to be blocked, like you're not getting any premiums on, or you're not getting any interest payments on that loan, not premiums. My head was still on the insurance side. And we have had some interesting cases. There is, for example, one P&I club out there called RO Marine, and they are what we call a high-risk P&I club. They insure several hundred vessels that are all part of the dark fleet. On paper, if you look at the IMO data, they have like 3 or 4 vessels, but we do know it's much larger. I can't tell you how I know that, but we do. And they're kind of shut down and now being investigated by the Norwegian police. But during the entire time of their operation, they hold a bank account. They're operating in that jurisdiction, and that they were basically providing insurance cover to several hundred vessels engaged in primarily Russian sanctions evasion, but as well as Iran and stuff like that. I'd say like, it might seem like the Nordics is a sleepy area for sanctions, but at least on the maritime side, it's definitely not, right? That we have a lot of risk up there.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that because, working in the Nordics, it's a society of trust. And sometimes you have conversations with the people in the business areas and you're trying to explain, that they need to take risks seriously, even though it's a low risk jurisdiction. We still need to have our guard up, have controls in place. And sometimes the answer you get is, we're fine. It's low risk here. This is where we're domiciled. And it's like, well,
IKEA stores are there across the globe, right?
exactly.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think and that's sometimes part of my job, right? And this is why we do these things, is to educate people, right? That, when I go in and I talk about hey, here are some of the lawsuits I'm currently working on, people are like, oh shit, that can happen. When I was talking about the victims of terrorism, the ATA with someone, they're like, wait, this is real? I'm like, yeah, this is real. And so I think that's why programs like this are important to educate people, to be like, hey, look, there is risk, and it's never as sleepy as you say it seems to be.
Exactly. And as you talk about terrorism, I don't like to date some of the recordings we do, but I have to, recognize that today is the 24th year anniversary of September 11th. So anybody who's watching this that, had family that they lost, our prayers are with you. It's been a long time, but still, it's pretty a tough pill to swallow. I was living in New York at the time. Luckily, I lived in Brooklyn, so away from that. But, we've had family friends that had passed away. My wife was, in her dorm room was very close to there. So luckily she's still with us today. But yeah, terrorism is a real thing, especially in the US. I feel like sometimes people think it's like another country thing, but I think September 11th was a wake up call and subsequent things that have happened there. But yeah, sorry to go off in a tangent, but yeah, I feel like, even modern day, BSA and sanctions, it's all due to that incident.
Yeah, no,
Sorry
I
so
mean,
much.
that was the point. And I mean, I'm glad you brought this up because sometimes we talk about sanctions in a clinical way or, a distant way, but I mean, the dark fleet is designed so that the IRGC can get money to commit commit terrorism, or, Russia can fund its war effort against Ukraine, which has killed 500,000 people at this point, right? I mean, what we do matters here. And you're right. The BSA regulations directly stemmed from 2001, right? I mean, they were put in with the Patriot Acts.
Mhm.
It's always a reminder that what we do is actually important, right? That it's hard to measure our progress individually when we're at a bank
Right.
and so distant, but collectively, it saves lives, or we hope it does.
Exactly. Yeah. So I guess now continuing with the conversation about Iran, you mentioned it a little bit earlier in your introduction that, there's been recent discussions about the EU enacting a snapback on sanctions on Iran. So I'm just curious, how do you think a reinstatement of sanctions would be, and what would be immediate effects on the dark fleet's operations?
Yeah, I mean, it'll have to depend on the level of the snapback and where the EU goes, right? If it's snapping back everything, and then if they're going to actively designate things. I'll say this, that most of my client, or I think 100% of my clients that are European banks, their sanctions policies already prohibit, dealings with Iran or other, primarily US focused sanctions programs, right? I mean, you have your big four in a sanctions policy always of, the US, the EU, the UK, and the UN, right? And then your local jurisdictions as well. So I think if banks have been sort of staying on top of their policy, I actually don't think it will be a huge deal, right? I think one thing that will make it a bit easier, and this is, I mean, it's a blessing in disguise almost, because, with the election of the current administration in the US, right, we've kind of stopped doing this whole Russia thing, and sanctions. And on the EU side, there has been some acrimony about how the US has treated its allies, right? But they've specifically decided to focus only on Russia. And you see this with like an individual named Hussein Shimkhani, right? He is the son of the IRGC admiral that's in head of the IRGC's Navy. He ran a sprawling network of vessels that was dealing in Russian and Iranian crude. And the EU's, I think is the 19th or the 18th sanctions package hit him. I forget which one. And it was all about like his role with Russia. And even though like his address was literally in Tehran, they were like, blinders, we're not seeing Iran anywhere. And then like 2 weeks later, the US designates him for his work in Iran and stuff like that. And it's created this split screen effect, right? Where in the courts, and this is where I think snapback will actually be helpful, like, you go up and you are dealing with an EU counterparty and it involves Iranian interest, and you try and terminate that according to your sanctions clause. And if it wasn't written properly, they'll be like, but we're in the EU, we're not in the US, and we're going to jurisdiction shop to sue you so that we can sue you in a jurisdiction that'll be favorable to our opinion, right? The US courts at least are a little bit better about that. But I think like the snapback will help in that if the EU does target Iran's side of the dark fleet as well, and sort of targets these other things, like it will erase some of these conflicts of law that can crop up. And it'll be make it easier for all of us to do our jobs, right? To say, hey, here's our sanctions policy. We're getting out of this without fear of being sued because we're terminating an agreement on our side of the bargain and stuff. Does that make sense? Or I know that was probably not the answer you're expecting.
No, it makes sense. I guess the tricky part that I see also is that, as you mentioned, America now has the America First kind of viewpoint. And during the previous administration, they were trying to be more lockstep with the other governments and jurisdictions, but now we're seeing a divergence again. So in some ways, like you said, the snapback will help, but for the rest of the programs, it still might be shifting apart. So I mean, I'm just curious to kind of hear your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. The Trump administration has not been nice to Europe. And I think that, the Biden administration, we've always said we wanted to be in lockstep. And the truth is, for Russia, we were never as in lockstep as people say, right? Like the EU and UK were always significantly ahead of the US. That they, for instance, designate Sovcomflot, Russia's state-owned tanker fleet, a year and a half before we did, and it was becoming a sticking point. But I think one of my fears is that in the Europe, we have the anti-blocking statute, right? And, and that affects different sanctions programs that prohibit a European person from blocking funds, that the statute disagrees with. That's never been enforced because there's always been an MOU, particularly for Iran, that there's that it would not be enforced for Iran sanctions, right? European companies could do what they want, but it's things like that if relationships continue to deteriorate and frustrations grow, that's something that I can absolutely see someone saying, okay, fine, we're just revoking this MOU, right? If you want to go your way, we're just going to go ours. And that would be incredibly painful, right? If you're a bank and you're trying to split upholding U.S. sanctions policy, and remember, the U.S. is a very long arm of its enforcement law, right? We can press a lot of cases. It kind of puts you in an impossible situation, saying, do I break EU law or do I break U.S. law? And none of us want to be in that, right? So, I'll be interested to see if we get back into lockstep. I do think we're still going to continue to see the split screen approach. There's no indication that the U.S. is going to get back into the Russia game anytime soon, but I think it could get worse, but we have to see if it is going to. Like, it's something that it's just not in our power to control and stuff.
Yeah. Makes sense. Yeah. And it's like you said, we were never in unison, but it seemed like we were starting to pull in the right direction, which then as compliance officers, it made our lives a bit easier. But now if we start seeing that divergence again, like you said, it's going to be like, okay, which law we're choosing to break today. Like one, you can't, satisfy both sometimes.
Exactly.
So it's tricky. Yeah, and I guess continuing on this sentiment of Iran and Russia, we've seen that there is a collaboration between them to circumvent sanctions. What do you think are the most common tactics that you observed in that? I mean, obviously we talked about the dark fleet, but have you observed any other kind of common ways that they're kind of teaming up to evade sanctions?
I mean, we know that they share some infrastructure, right? And we're starting this, as I said, we're starting to see a lot of vessels bounce back and forth. On the maritime side, we still see different tactics, namely because Russia is related to the price cap, right? So there is an attestation process. So they're not, I mean, some vessels do engage in spoofing, but a lot of times we see them and they're squawking at a Russian port, right? It's on a documentary basis. Oh no, we probably promised we're below 47.5, and stuff like that. It's like, sure, okay, cool. I believe that 0%. But we do see shared resources. We see companies that do both of these things. We wouldn't be surprised if they are sharing tactics with one another. Obviously Iran feeds arms to Russia. So, and Shimkhani was a good example, right? He was dealing in Russian crude, he was dealing in Iranian crude. And the money that he was raising was then going to be used to some of it. I mean, he got very rich off of it, was going to be used to purchase weapons that were then sent to Iran on his vessels and stuff, or sent to Russia on his vessels. So, I mean, so a lot of these networks, a lot of these front companies in the UAE, these third-party countries, they are easily shared. Right. It's going to differ depending on the threat actor, but there's definitely this convergence and stuff.
And I guess piggybacking off of that, what do you think are main obstacles for regulators, I guess on both sides of the pond, in enforcing these sanctions on the dark fleet? I know you talked about the price cap and other things, but do you see that it's working, what we have in place? Do you think there's other things that we could do to make it better? Just curious to your thoughts on that.
I mean, I think regulators are still in the grappling and asking phase. What I mean by that is, during an examination, they come in and say, like, what are you doing about the dark fleet? And then you turn around saying, what should we be doing about the dark fleet? And they're like, read the OFAC guidance, right? So like, I haven't heard of any MRAs that have been, I haven't heard of any MRAs that have been dropping specifically related to the dark fleet, but I think it's time. I mean, everyone should have some form of vessel tracking software at this point. I know this is self-serving when I say this, but, I mean, as you can say, starting in like 2012, we started reappropriating software to track vessels. And it's getting better, right? Some of the algorithms that we've worked on with, say, Polestar to detect spoofing have actually gotten pretty good. Like, where I'm like, oh, I'm worried they're going to take my job away and everything like that, right? And automated STS pairing. And so there's a lot that guide you through there. I think the hard part is, like, we talk a lot about how the dark fleet and the bad guys have adopted new tactics and technology, but we don't talk often about what technology we have as well, right? That we have tech that we use on a daily basis that used to only be the domain of militaries, right? This is imagery. This is, RF detection. We have other cyber-enabled means that I'm not going to speak about directly, right? But the question is, how do we get this in the compliance departments, right? When I say, okay, it's time that we actually start looking at satellite imagery, people pull out their pitchforks, right? But then when I go and teach them, like, actually, you can do this fairly efficiently. And they're like, oh, that actually wasn't as hard as I thought it was, And so I think, like, moving in that direction is necessary. I do think that there needs to be a little bit of specialization. Once again, I know this is self-serving when I say this, but like, my team and I live and breathe the dark fleet, right? We know these actors, we know the vessels. Like, I can get on and instantaneously spot like a bunch of vessel spoofing just because, like, that's my job. As a compliance officer, you have all these other jobs and stuff like that. And so, I mean, I do think that's another thing is, outsourcing some maritime intelligence, right? So our approach tends to be what we call tools, targeting, and training. Tools being, your purple tracks, right? Your vessel screening and tracking softwares. targeting being like the watch list that we provide, and then training being, we will go in there and be like, this is how Iran moves their money. This is what spoofing looks like, and we try and give like easily actionable red flags that aren't going to break the bank, so that people on, say, the first line or the first level of alert handling can escalate stuff up, that they're easy to see. They don't have to be a whiz about this and stuff. And so, I think that's where we need to be going. And I think people are getting it. They're starting to talk about it. And then, there's always this year and a half cycle for regulators of, OFAC said something, and then, expectations are then a year and a half later after they've sort of figured out what everyone's doing and stuff. So I hope that answered it and stuff.
No, definitely. And I think there's two things I want to call out here is that one, you're right, there is software and tools for us to use as practitioners. The problem we face is budgetary, which I'm sure you've heard before, because there's a lot of institutions that feel like we don't need the tools to do this extra research, but we do, because there's no other way to do it. There's the free tools out there, but it doesn't get into the depth and the accuracy as the paid ones do. So I give that to you 100%. And, maybe we could do another session another time where we talk about more of the technology and how you do it. Don't give away the nitty gritty, but some pearls of wisdom to get people interested. So yeah, I agree. That's one thing, because that's a bit of a dark area for a lot of teams. I think there's certain institutions that might build out an investigative team, or I think there was actually, I forgot which bank it was, but it was a bank in the U.S. subsidiary of this bank had like a dedicated like team that looked at vessel movement and stuff like that. And that was the first that I've ever heard of it, but it proven results, because now you, like you said, you have people that know the techniques, they know what they're looking for, and the escalations are better, because now it's not just looking at certain thresholds, which may or may not mean that there's nefarious activity going on. But now you have people who are actively working on these things that could make better judgment calls.
Absolutely. And actually, that's one thing we're planning on launching, is like a maritime sanctions investigator course, where it's like a day-long course. And just training 2 or 3 people in the institution is like, this is our vessel guy, right? Because I don't think like every level 3 analyst needs to know this. And we're talking about that level 3, right? We're not talking about false positive clearing or anything like that. But like when 2 or 3 people, one person and another person for when that person's on vacation, right? And I'm sure like we're getting there with export controls as well, right? Hey, we have our BIS nerd or ECCN nerd. Is this part of the common high priority list, and what do we look for and stuff like that, right? I do think that's where we're trending.
Yeah, there's definitely a convergence, like you're pointing out, with between export controls and trade compliance and the sanctions community. And actually, I'm going to have soon a recorded session on that too, because I am not an export control expert, but I'm very interested in it. But if you don't have that specific training and that kind of insight, it's difficult to get it. And sometimes you get pigeonholed into doing one thing.
Exactly.
They're like, oh, you're a sanctions guy, you can't do export controls. It's like, why? I want to learn that. Teach me.
That's the fun thing about like sanctions compliance, is like, you're gonna like, I know how buttons are manufactured. Don't ask me how I know. You learn so much crap in this just because like we touch every part of the economy everywhere.
It's so true. Because, talking about that, it's like, I didn't realize that, the United States is looking at components in materials. So, Tesla, I forgot how long ago it was, they purchased batteries from Canada, but it had cobalt from Cuba. Like, I didn't know that they had so many, like they could go down to that detail, right? And I think for the technology industry, it's a bit different, where it's easier to kind of say, all right, these parts are American, these parts are from somewhere else. Based on, the percentage of what's being used, it could be considered an American product as a whole or not. If it's sold in pieces, obviously, then you're looking at different jurisdictions for each, but it could be many different ways to look at it. But what I'm really surprised has not happened yet, and I think this was maybe talked about coming out in the next package, was that they're not looking at the substantial transformation of oil because they're pulling out oil from Russia, from Ukraine even. It goes to refineries in Turkey and India. But once it's refined there, it's no longer a Ukrainian or Russian product. Now it's a product of where it's refined. So, so I've heard rumblings and grumblings that might change, but that might impact the oil industry too much because then it might shrink the amount that's available. But I don't know. Do you have any insight on that bit?
It's also going to be enormously hard to prove, right? I mean, the reason that we adopted that stance was like once it's refined. I mean, the problem is like even on blending, we have a lot of floating storage units that the moment they take on Russian cargo, all of that cargo aboard now has a little bit of Russia in it, right? And is therefore tainted, right? So when it's refined, it's very hard to track. I get where they're going here, right? Because you have refineries in certain countries, namely India and China, right, that are taking this and, they're refining it and then they're selling it to the market. And then you have a report that says like basically, oh, look, Reliance took on 50% of their oil. I'm just making up numbers here, right? But took on 50% of their oil from Russia. And so 50% of their exports are going to the US. So we know that, it's Russian oil is going to the US, right? That's impossible to track. Once you can just imagine it, take two liquids, stir them together and then say, separate the molecules, right? I think like one route that would probably be more productive to actually accomplish their means is just simply sanctioning the refineries, right? Or threatening some form of secondary sanctions, or material assistance sanction to say, hey, look, you received a lot of Russian product. We know they were not at cap. There's no way you wouldn't have known they're at cap. Here you go. You're now on our list. And I think the warning shot for that was Nayara Energy, right? When they sanctioned that. So yeah, if they go to like, you have to separate out refined products, I'm just going to quit.
No, we can't deal with that. But yeah, I mean, I guess that makes sense, right? You can't test everything. You can't be, have a chemist there testing it all.
Yeah.
They might be traces, but we're already inundated with different parts of our job. Who has the time to do that?
Well, even when you do bring in a chemist, right? Because we do have like this for blending and stuff like that. Like, so like Iraqi oil is high on sulfur. So like the 4% threshold is what we say is like that tends to be Iraqi, whereas Iranian oil is cleaner and their maximum sulfur is like 3.5%, right? So like when people try and pass off like, oh, this is Iraqi oil and like they blend it in Iranian, like it brings the sulfur content down by average and we can see like how far it's gone. So like, but we can't separate that out, right? Now we just like the entire cargo is tainted and sorry guys, like you get to sell it on really big discount to port in China.
Boy. So I mean, changing gears a bit, I know earlier you talked about Oro Marine. Was there anything else you wanted to kind of deep dive into regarding that case?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's emblematic, and I apologize that I stepped a little ahead, right? But I mean, I think it's emblematic of one of the key risks that we're seeing with the dark fleet. That if you're a vessel, you don't enter a port or set sail with three things. You need survey certificates from a class society saying you're safe. Then you need insurance from a P&I club saying you're insured, and that's called a blue card. And then you need a flag. We've seen essentially an entire ecosystem from all three of these different parties where, companies are being set up specifically to cater to sanctions evasion or the dark fleet or illicit activity. And I think the big takeaway here is that like now the authorities have finally caught on. The EU did sanction Intershipping Services. It is a company that ran the Gabon and Comoros flag. That was a big deal, right? Because it was basically a shot off the bow saying like, look, all you little flags, Djibouti, Cameroon, pay attention because you can be sanctioned for what you do and stuff like that. And these flags are typically run by private companies as well. So it's not like we're sanctioning the government of them. But like RO Marine was emblematic of that. They had an interesting history where they actually were started as a legitimate P&I club adventure between two different legit P&I club firms, but like it failed, so they abandoned it, but the company was never dissolved. So another individual took it over and then started using it to fraudulently insure the dark fleet. But that's what we're dealing with, guys. Think of it like this. There were at any given time several hundred vessels sailing the seas with insurance that was ostensibly provided by these guys. And and the punchline now is like, yes, the Norwegian police shut them down and it's a criminal investigation. Hopefully people will go to jail over it, right? So yeah, like I think like the takeaway is that we also have to be vigilant of, not just the vessels and the companies trading the oil, but like start tackling these networks, and I think the authorities are moving in the right direction. So I wouldn't be surprised in this next package if we had other flags or maybe an insurer too. But you have to check that too, right? Because if you're doing an LC for a transaction, the vessel does not have good insurance, like you're sticking your neck out there as well for, at the end of the day, $100 for your LC rate, where if something goes wrong, it's a $2 billion lawsuit, as I said. So yeah, I guess that's the quick and dirty on our rate that I could probably discuss publicly.
And, I guess to round that off, it's easier to investigate vessels and the operators and stuff like that, but I guess maybe a bit less so to investigate the P&I clubs or the insurers. But what tips would you have for recognizing patterns similar to RO or maybe companies like them, or red flags that might be visible, or, because at the end of the day, financial institutions and maritime authorities have to be better at detecting these shell companies or this nefarious activity.
Yeah.
So yeah, what tips would you have to share with us on that?
So I think step by step for the flags, institutions are starting, like I have heard of company, and like I think a few of my clients just blacklist certain flags. Like we're just not going to deal with vessels that belong to these flags. So your big three in the world are Liberia, Marshall Islands, and Panama. And they're perfectly normal flags. Panama does have issues, which their director notes, but like they're generally a reputable institution, right? It's these fly-by-night countries, Gabon, Comoros, Cameroon, Djibouti, some of the Antilles now. Mongolia was one for a second, stuff like that, that it might be worth sort of looking into and sort of blacklisting them. A lot of the vessel tracking and screening software allows you to blacklist flags of your choice as well, and so that's something to look into. On the insurer side, so the maritime insurance market, the biggest insurers are part of what we call the International Group of P&I Clubs, the IG. And all of these clubs are reputable. Some of them have had issues before, but like they're not going out of their way to insure sanctioned vessels. It's just the stuff's hard, and bad guys do slip through, right? And they all have a reinsurance pool as well. And so they're generally considered the gold standard. So if the vessel that you're dealing with is insured by one of them, then your risk is much lower. If we start seeing a P&I club that's, that is Russian, for example, Russia's reinsurance corporation that backs all these P&I clubs is under sanctions. So even if that P&I club is not yet under sanctions, like Ingostrock and VSK are, like you still have a potential sanctions nexus here because the reinsurer is. And if it's listing as unknown, honestly, like if we are doing trade finance, right, we already get the bills of lading, we're already getting substantial documentation. That's one thing we may want to actually consider, right? Is like, or if we're vetting a vessel or, to nominate it for, to charter it for commodities is, get the blue card, look at the insurer. And then does this person look reputable? Give me a call. I'll tell you yes or no, right? But I guess it really also just raises the question because you're going to have a subset of vessels that automatically look fine. You're going to have a subset that automatically look bad because they're insurers in like Russia and Iran. or is under sanctions. And then you're either going to have a vessel that, like on the software, it says that the insurer is not known because they haven't publicly reported it to the IMO, or you've never heard of them. And I think at that point, it may be worth on a risk basis to stop and say, hey, look, this is a tanker. It could be carrying product that could get us in trouble. Do we want to send an RFI asking for the blue card for this vessel and stuff?
Oh, great point. Thank you for that insight and those pearls of wisdom. And yeah, this is a good segue into kind of what your recommendations would be, like looking forward, let's say 2 or 3 years. What trends do you foresee in dark fleet operations, and especially in light of the geopolitical tension and potential regulatory changes that might come?
Yeah, I mean, the dark fleet's not going away. I think this is going to be a problem that's going to stay. They comprise 10% of all tanker tonnage, actually more than that at this point. So it is a threat, and it's clearly one that the authorities are focused on. This year, a third of all OFAC sanctions have focused on essentially the dark fleet and Iranian shipping. And we've seen with the EU packages, they have also heavily focused on this. And I think they're trending in the right direction from the authorities wise of not just hitting the vessels, as I said, but also taking out that infrastructure that supports the dark fleet, that helps it run, right? Because I think if we put these flags and insurers out of business, the fake insurers, that's going to significantly affect the dark fleet's ability to operate, period. And that might remedy that. I mean, from banks, I think we've talked a little bit about the need for vessel tracking software. I know this is self-serving when I say that, but I mean, for specialized services, this is where training is also important. That every quarter we do a training topic on something, whether it's Iranian invasion or case that we saw, or what forged documents look like. And so, I mean, that's what I just recommend, right? Tools, targeting, and training. Have the software in place to create your initial alerts, supplement it, much as we do with sanctioned ownership lists, or securities lists from Six Financial and stuff like that, right? Because there are experts like my team. There's other teams out there as well that do this, that we live and breathe this. And then the training, and making sure it's tailored to the right level. That level 1, here are 5 red flags to look for. They are very easy to understand. If the transaction involves oil from Iraq, escalate it, right? And then at the higher levels, that's where we incorporate these new tools. I do see, because these new tools are becoming more accessible, I wouldn't be surprised if there is more investment in it. And some of them are actually free, Sentinel-2 is part of the European Space Agency, so you can look at satellite imagery for free. My shop uses it all the time, right? It's just, how do we get them in there, and how do we convince people to adopt them is always the long road for change and compliance. So
no, thank you for sharing. And I think you kind of answered my next question already. It's how do we protect ourselves from inadvertently dealing with the dark fleet? And you talked about training, you talked about tools and technology, and also targeted training, right? So you're not gonna, give first line people this crazy amount of training that it should be for third line. So making sure you're giving people what they need. And I think that also leads to better outcomes, because not only do they have the right training, but they understand the why of what they're doing and how it ties into everything else, right? So if you do what you're supposed to do, this is how, you might not get a pat in the back from the local regulators or the competent authorities, but we
you
have
won't
to
get
do our own pats on the back for helping society.
exactly. And you also won't get an MRA either.
Yeah.
No, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you also make a great point, right? That training should be bite-sized. I mean, I do think and this is a meta, it's not just a dark fleet issue, that we've built compliance programs around controls that may no longer be providing the level of control that we want for the effort that we're putting into them, right? And I mean, if you take your red flags checklist, there'll be 30 different red flags, and the doc checkers just check, right? But if you can be these are the 7 things we want you to look out for, people can comprehend that, right? I mean, the same thing, maybe we want to pare back our filters a little bit so that we're not generating 10% of all alerts on 10% of all transactions, right? Maybe we want to assume a little risk there so that we can free up 20 FTEs that we can put into more productive controls and stuff like that. I mean, that's a fight that I do have with regulators all the time, but I think even they're starting to agree. Like, that's a story probably for a beer more than anything. So no, I do think that's like a really good observation of like make it bite-sized, right?
Yeah, for sure. All right, so we're just about to wrap things up. So now I want to kind of get your idea, closing thoughts on, if there could be, if you could implement one policy or regulatory change to combat the dark fleet or sanctions, we could open it up a bit. What do you think it would be? What would you suggest?
Just one?
You could give us a couple.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the regulatory side, okay, so the good news is on the regulatory side, we're seeing the right direction, right? I would love to see US get back on the Russia train and everyone to become friends again. And I would say, like, this is a weird one, but I've kind of alluded to it, which I was actually really appreciative in the last EU sanctions package. There was tucked in there that there was a passage that basically says that when a sanctioned person conducts a frivolous lawsuit against a EU party for following sanctions, like courts are no longer allowed to give deference to that or something like that. And I think the biggest issue that we're seeing sometimes is that there has been cowing of banks and compliance officers to say, okay, if this transaction's tickling my spider senses and I don't like it, right, let's terminate that. But then there's this fear of being sued, oftentimes in like even frivolous standpoints, right, and stuff like that. And so along with like these sanctions, I would love to see the EU do more of that, as well as the US, is to offer protections to compliance officers and people that are trying to follow the law, so that when they do the right thing, they don't get stuck with this other basket of horrible that are other second consequences. So very far off thing, but it's something that we see on the dark fleet all the time, because like bad guys, like you will terminate a contract and do the right thing exactly that you're supposed to do. You're a US person. I don't want to go to jail, especially under this administration, right? But then after we terminate the contract, literally the sanctioned person will file lawsuits against you for stealing their cargo and stuff. And that does have this chilling effect, right? So I was really glad to see that in the EU, and I'd love to see more of that. Totally not the answer you're expecting, I know.
No, but that's a good curveball, and I think it's well taken, because it's, for us, it's damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? So it's like, obviously the regulations and the laws, that's the bare minimum, that sets the standard, and then we try to do a bit more, because we need to understand what the spirit of the law is, what we're trying to achieve. But then then we're hit with we're being told, oh well, you're gold plating, or you're doing too much, or like you said, you're erring on the side of caution, and then you could be sued later. So I get it in the negative way, where if we mess up intentionally, yeah, we should be sued, right, by the authorities. But if we're trying to do the right thing, protect our company, where's our protection then, right? Well, all right. And yeah, and this is the last question, I promise, but what resources and initiatives should our audience follow to stay informed about this evolving issue, but also, kind of the things we spoke about today?
Well, NFCP, of course. No, I mean, look, I think these groups are good. You have ACSS, you have a good network there. You have your network of other fellow compliance officers as well. I do think that there are a bunch of associations, such as this one, ACSS, that aren't an expensive buy-in, and they're not just sort of selling something on the side, right? ACAMs can get very large and salesy and expensive, whereas, more focused conferences can be much better and stuff like that. There's a lot of really good investigative reporting going out on this as well. It's not just from some of your main publications. I know Bloomberg has a very good team. Wall Street Journal and New York Times also have very good teams that have done some really great pieces on this. But then you have like your OCCRPs or other journalist organizations that are within the ICIJ, where, really smart and just really talented investigators that can figure out anything. So keep abreast of them, right? And then maybe, if you really are focused on the maritime side, some less traditional news sources too. They can be a little expensive sometimes to see if your organization has a subscription, but Trade Winds, not to throw business to a competitor, but Lloyd's List Intelligence has a really good journalism team. We compete on other things, but I can say nice things. I know the folks over there, so we always are making fun of one another. But these are all these resources. I guess once again, shameless pitch, but I don't even think it's that shameless. Is that my team does free training? If you want to learn about Iran, give us a call, and we are more than happy to sit in front of your bank and tell you exactly how they're moving the cargo and the money and stuff like that. So when you see opportunities like that, jump on it, right? If it's free, then awesome.
Right. It's funny. I was talking to somebody the other day and they said, well, if it's free, then maybe people look at it differently and maybe that it's not quality or it's not good. But I kind of beg to differ because I also don't want money to get in the way of education and learning. So I applaud you for having that initiative because, other people would just put it behind a paywall. I know obviously the more intensive stuff you guys do, they would have to kind of, contract with you, but it's great that you have at least this baseline that you're willing to provide to others. And, that's what we're trying to also facilitate here with NFCP. So all to say is it's appreciated. And I hope you keep up the good work and the good fight.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I think there's times to make a buck. The Tannenbaum family's got to eat, but then there's also times where it's like, as you said, bad things happen when we fail.
Exactly. Awesome. So on that note, I'll let you go. But before I do, I just want to really thank you again for your time and for hanging out with us and giving us some pearls of wisdom and to think about and to take back to wherever we call work, our work home. And again, if you have any questions for David, please reach out to him on LinkedIn. He's quite active there. He'll, give you the information you need or put you in touch with people in his team. You could reach out to us if you want to, ask questions to David. We could be the middleman if you want, or you could go directly to him, but we're happy to facilitate that as well. Especially if you found anything really interesting, please let us know. Please provide feedback, as well as if there's anything that you think we should work on in the future with David, please let us know, because then we could, beg him to come back and have a chat with us. So again, nfcp.info, LinkedIn, we're there as well. Reach out to David, reach out to me. And we'll call it a day. So again, thank you very much. Have a great rest of the week and weekend when you get there, and hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you for having me. This has been fun.
Awesome. Take care, David.
You too.
Bye.
Bye. Yeah.